Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Be Not Afraid. I'm very excited for my guest today, who is Susanna Alexander. We are going to be discussing mental health. As kids go back to school, a lot of our schools are adopting things like whole child, whole school, whole community, or the WISC program. But where does it come from? What is going on? Should we trust the mental health that is happening in our school system? Well, today I have a whistleblower and an investigator, and we're going to dig deeply into that subject. So thank you so much for joining me, Susanna.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So we actually tried to have a conversation about a year ago, and I was running for office and everything went crazy and awry. So, but I've wanted to have this conversation, and I've seen some of the work that you're doing with organizations like FAIR, um, and just talk to me about what's going on in mental health.
Well, when I think about it, it's like that. I have done a lot of investigation here, particularly recently, that's shown me a side that goes even further into a level of corruption that I didn't really recognize was there, which is pretty disturbing. But what's going on in mental health, if I'm going to, try and shave it down to an elevator pitch or something like that, it has been ideologically captured. And what is coming out of the major organizations like the APA, the ACA, so that's American Counseling Association, or American Psychological Association, these major groups, and the associated universities is all pushing an ideology that most people would recognize as DEI, social justice, or with a global perspective, rather than something focused on American, when it is specifically listed as like the ACA specifically supposed to be focusing on our national objectives, one would think, but that's not the underlying philosophy of what they're doing. That's what's going on, and it has repercussions in places in society that you would not, it wouldn't be your first thought. Particularly one of the places I think is in policy and in policy initiatives. It was just this morning reading a book on from the APA about going global, how what they would like to do is have more of a global influence to push forward this ideology.
So understand where you're talking about when you're talking about ideology, but let's break that down. There are people, I know it's shocking because we've known about this stuff for years, but can we break down what DEI in mental health counseling looks like? And also, your background is this, that you went to school to be a counselor, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, and I can probably talk most succinctly from that experience about what is DEI, because in counseling, the American Counseling Association, and the accreditor for counseling programs, which is KCREP, they put into their standards for every accredited program for counseling in higher education that has their accreditation. And they are by far the largest accreditor, with nearly 500 university programs across the country just under their banner. Um, their standard calls for diversity, equity, and inclusion to be pervasive in the program. And what that means is that they require hiring standards that focus on diversity. They require that student recruitment focus on diversity. And while they don't specifically state that certain numbers of races are required, they do require reporting on how diverse is, any given program's student body or their faculty. And when it comes to the curriculum, what that means is that every class and every textbook and most of your assignments are framed from the standpoint of, like how do we racialize this, or how do we bring identity politics in this? So you could be in your ethics class and you would be given a situation to analyze, and it would be framed where you would be talking about, this Native American person, has a depression problem, and they had a run-in with, a white Christian couple, and then somebody from Asia moved in, and these scenarios just kind of are developed to create an ethical quandary that you're supposed to figure out. But the framing of all of it is on identity lines. And so the question becomes, like, how do you manage all of these different racial and identity issues, rather than, how do you deal with the ethical problem that is really just between you and the client? That's where the ethical issue should be, or between you and the group. And
So let me
when it
break that
comes,
down. If I were to come into if I were to come into a therapy session and have depression, say I lost a sibling, and that's what I was coming in to focus on, you would be directed to have that conversation specifically about, to turn it into something it wasn't about.
well, you're specifically taught, and this is called broaching, to redirect the conversation around to race. That's something that they teach you in skills class. So regardless of what the client comes in for, you're taught to redirect the conversation around to race, because I guess the underlying philosophy, I've read it. It's not particularly coherent, but it is that these racial issues are the most important dynamic that's ever happening in a situation. And so whatever the client comes in for, eventually you want to redirect the conversation around to race, as though that is the root issue of anyone's problems in any situation.
So what if you were dealing with a client who was also white?
Then it would be the fact that they were an oppressor. Then you would want to redirect around to that. And because then you would be in a situation where, if I was the counselor, I would be privileged, and my client would be privileged. And so then we would need to redirect the conversation around to dealing with that privilege.
Even if the subject had nothing to do with it. So a lot of people will go to counseling after maybe a divorce. So you have a
Mm-hmm.
divorce of a Caucasian person divorcing another Caucasian person. That's the subject that they're coming to you for. Also, the subject that they're paying to come to you for.
Mm-hmm.
And you're supposed to turn that into, correct me if I'm wrong, social justice.
Yes. Yes, that's how it's framed. And there's a class called multicultural counseling, and that is a required class under the CACREP standard. So everyone that goes to a CACREP accredited program has to take a multicultural counseling class. And the entire body of that curriculum, which I have looked up the textbooks of almost all of the classes, what's being taught across the country. And the most popular textbook is Counseling the Culturally Diverse by Daryl Dwayne Sue. And it's broken up into chapters, and each chapter focuses on different races. And so when you get to the class, or you get to the chapter on the white identity, the focus of that is, how to acknowledge your whiteness, and how to deal with your whiteness, and how to make sure that your whiteness does not impact, clients of color or your coworkers, other therapists and that sort of thing. And you can you can go to the ACA website, and in their magazine, the Counseling Today, there was an article, this is back from 2023, talking about dealing with whiteness in the counseling room. And it basically reiterates everything that is in the chapter of that book. And there's several other books. There's quite a few other books that are used across the country, but they all circle back to the same underlying philosophy. Some are worse and some are maybe a little bit more patty cake around it, but they're all saying basically the same thing, that these identity characteristics are what's important, and that is the culture. So like your culture is determined by your skin color, regardless of whether, you came from Norway or, you were from Kurdistan. You have the white culture because that's the color of your skin.
Well, that's something I'd love clarification on, because I was listening to someone who said that whiteness doesn't necessarily mean your skin tone. And I know that people will look at somebody like me and say, oh, you act white. What in the world? What does whiteness mean to a therapist?
Well, this is so crazy. It makes me so uncomfortable to talk about, because I find it so insulting and so diminishing of our texture as human beings. But the way that, this is my understanding of what they're talking about with whiteness. And whiteness has more to do with certain cultural ideas. So like something that's associated with whiteness is reasoning, using reasoning to solve your problems, rather than your lived experience or your felt experience.
Your
um
emotion.
your emotion, right.
Saying that
Another.
minorities are more emotional in general, as I have like, I'm not really crying. My eyes just has something,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
but emotion.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right.
okay.
Other things that would fall under whiteness would be the scientific method. There are research textbooks out there now for counseling that I have written about and read about, that talk about, they kind of go along in this way and saying, well, maybe there's an objective truth, but we have all of these other factors for truth, because the idea of objective truth, that's related to whiteness and colonialization, and therefore it's like it has this taint on it, because it was associated with the same characteristics of the people who, you know left Europe and colonized and, brought their ideas and that sort of thing with them, as though everything that came out of that process is somehow tainted by the fact that bad things happened in that process.
What's crazy about that is when I think about people who oftentimes don't have emotion, I think about people who have basically been enslaved by things like socialism. Okay, people who are like, I recently listened to Yeonmi Park, and her saying that when she was a young teenager, she had to walk by dead bodies. There's a certain amount of turning off your emotion to be able to walk by dead bodies. So those are Asian people. How
Mm-hmm.
about people in Africa who have a very strong sense of grit? Not everybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because nobody, you can't blanket statement a group of people. So it seems like a manipulation, and it seems, I mean, how do students swallow this?
Well, not all of them do. I am happy to report. I hear regularly from people who they get into these programs thinking the same way that I did, that this was the same training that you'd have seen 20 years ago that was focused on psychology, that was based on science, where you try and replicate your results and you get replicated results or you throw it out. And they run into this and they're like, oh my God, what is this? They don't like it. Um, that said, there's also a certain percentage, fairly large in some classes, perhaps more than others, of people that very much buy into this ideology, either because it works for them. There is a certain segment of the population who recognizes, hey, I can exercise some power here. It's even in the Daryl Dwayne Sue, there's a section at the beginning where it talks about how a African American student enjoyed watching their peers squirm, going through this multicultural counseling, because they were encouraged and allowed to say racist things to white people. So there are some people who they like that.
It's sadistic.
Yes, it is sadistic.
And
But
what did he say in it? Was he praising it? Was he okay with the fact that there are people who
well,
are okay with the process?
the way that they characterize it in the textbook is to say, well, we know that there are some students that will find enjoyment in watching their peers squirm, but we think that maybe you shouldn't do that. And like, if you think about it, if you recognize that your training is evoking sadism in other people, you redo your training. You don't acknowledge that it's happening and saying, well, don't do that, guys. That's not going to work. That's not ever going to work. It's like, planning out and having the Milgram experiment and saying, oh, that seems to bother people. Oh, just don't be bothered by that. It's just like that. That's not going to work.
The power of suggestion. It's the power,
Mm-hmm.
like, to say, well, some of you might take joy in treating other people badly.
Mm-hmm.
We shouldn't do that. But
Yeah,
basically said you've normalized it for some people.
exactly.
If I feel this way, I'm not the first person who felt this way.
Right.
And what's crazy to me is that, and I'm someone who's had a whole lot of therapy growing up, not because I was necessarily crazy, but I grew up in the foster system. So I had a whole lot of therapy growing up. And I really appreciated my very good therapist, who I had almost the entire time. Because one, the focus was an end point. The two was to teach me to actually be resilient, which I'm going to ask you about in a moment. And the third one is that people who get into therapy tend to be compassionate human beings. At least that's what it used to be. And now it seems like it's attracting the social justice warrior, which, in my opinion, is the biggest bullies. That's what I see when I see social justice, because they find that there is a group that it is okay to bully, and so they can virtue signal and say that they're kind to everyone else, but there is a group that it is okay to beat down.
Yes, I would agree with that entirely. It's one of the changes that happened particularly to counseling, but I think that it moved from counseling into psychology. And for people who are aware, if you go to a therapist, there's very few programs that are called therapy training. There is marriage and family therapists, but there's also psychologists, counselors, social workers, psychiatrists. There are psychiatric nurse practitioners, and all of them are qualified to do some form of talk therapy. You tend to see more counselors and marriage and family therapists actually doing talk therapy, but social workers as well. And the others tend to stay in different boxes. Psychiatrists, tend to prescribe medications, and psychologists tend to do tests, but they all share this kind of therapy structure that they are allowed to do. So when counseling took on advocacy as their defining character, so they were trying to set, because there are all of these professions doing the same thing, they're trying to set themselves apart in a competitive way, and they took on advocacy, which for me, when I first started to dig in the history after I came out from my program, that didn't make sense to me. It's like, you advocate for a thing. What do you it's not, that's not a mission to be an advocate. You have to advocate for something. And what that became was this ideology of social justice, which came along with this advocacy mission. And it was a way that, at the time, this came from a series of meetings back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, but they went through, and that's when they decided on the advocacy mission. But they also had this meeting where they projected, this is what the future is going to be. So they kind of got together and, like, predicting the future is usually a bad idea, but we're going to do it anyway. And this is how we're going to set up the profession to be ready for this future that we would like to see. And a big part of that was their belief that the future was going to be more diverse, ethnically and in some other ways. And therefore, all counselors must adopt multiculturalism as a value. And in the original documents, Counseling Futures, it says they must use the counseling space to impress these multicultural values onto their clients. And when you follow the historical record, the talk of bringing it into the therapy room disappears when you get to around the 2010s. But in the practice, it's still there. Once they instituted these multicultural classes, teaching these ideals, breaking everything down by ideology, you've already brought it into the counseling space. And of course, obviously, when you bring broaching in, if you're going to redirect the conversation around to race, that is exactly what you're doing. It's the breach, the ethical breach is built into the training right now. And it had been, from what I can tell, I have some more research that I would like to do on the history of the APA and psychologists and that sort of thing, and some other fields. But the mission to advocate spread. I don't think it was ever completely localized in counseling, but it definitely has spread across the other professions. To some degree, psychiatrists, because they're a little bit more tied to medicine, have been insulated a little bit. But if you look at how they have enabled the transgender movement, they're as complicit as any other group in terms of allowing the foundational science underneath psychology to be eroded by this ideology. And that's where it stands.
So as I'm looking at this, and that you just brought up the transgender issue, I feel like the breaching, especially for young people, tends to be more gender than race. And it could be because I live in a small town but it is crazy. And I've had nurses reach out to me and say, why in the world am I being taught that I must prioritize race over healthcare? That I can't ask questions that I should be able to ask a person if I want them to get well. And that, I think, is a big concern for me as parents kind of give up on parenting to a certain point, or they give some of that responsibility to other people, professionals, right? They're giving that to them, and they're saying, well, you're the professional, you can help my child heal. It seems to me, though, that if social justice and advocacy is the goal is never to heal from it. Because the time a person says, you know what, I don't like this doesn't feel right to me, they then become the victim of the advocates.
Very much so. The way that I take in this training and what it develops in clients, particularly if you separate what we know about psychology from the before time, where it was based on evidence and it was focused and showed results in actually helping people, to where it is right now. What they're doing right now goes against what the prior information says was healthy. So a good example is the idea of microaggressions, which you are taught about in the multicultural counseling. And of course, that comes up through all of the other training. That's a big part of like the ethical issues, that I was describing earlier. It's like, well, there's, microaggressions. So to emotionally react to a small gesture that someone does in any other context would be a sign of a fragile sense of self or an unstable emotionality. If somebody kind of looks at you in a weird way, you have no information about what's going on. They could have forgotten their keys, or they could have just been remembering something their mother-in-law sent, and it has nothing to do with you. So when you encourage people to think that those sorts of things are actually about them, you are separating them from reality, because you're encouraging them to mind read about what that other person could actually be thinking or experiencing. And in the before times, that would be a diagnosable problem that you would teach people not to do. At a minimum,
You're
you would teach.
infantilizing people,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
you're keeping them in that mindset of a child who doesn't know any better, who reacts to whatever. They can't look at somebody and have perspective or even a little bit of generosity towards the person. They're just automatically assuming the worst about other
Right.
people.
Right. And the therapists who have been trained in this way are reinforcing that thought. So, what that creates is somebody who goes to therapy and has all of their bad feelings and bad thoughts validated. So, they feel really good in that hour that they are there. And then they go home and, feel worse because all of their bad thoughts have been validated, and then they come back again, and they'll just keep coming back, because every time they come to the therapy, they're getting validated, but they're getting validated for all of the wrong things, and in a way that it encourages their thinking to become more disordered and more separated from reality, which the reality is they don't know what other people are thinking. They don't know what's going on. In the before times, somebody who had that kind of pattern to their thinking, you would encourage them to slow down and do reality testing, and say, hey, ask them, if you are concerned about that, ask it, or at least question, why do you think that was about you? But that, none of that is what's happening in the training so much right now.
My big question is why? Because these ideas do not serve a person going to therapy. They do not help anyone heal. They do not help a person who's experienced extreme trauma have a better life. They keep them stuck.
Mm-hmm.
A therapist should be a person who comes in and sees the potential in you and helps you get to your destination. There should be an end date in therapy. And I mean, this is from my experience. I graduated therapy when I was 18. I went back again later in life, but I graduated the first round as I graduated high school. Um, and that was something to celebrate. That was to say, oh, I've got tools in my box that are
Mhm.
going to help me. And so when things go wrong, I will be able to go, well, that was a really bad day. That doesn't have to be a bad life. Sorry,
Mhm.
that's the cliche way that you're taught as a kid for therapy, right?
Yeah.
Now it's no, the world is very much against you and you must dismantle everything.
Mhm.
But again, when people go to counseling and they're feeling that, at some point they've got to go, this isn't going to help anyone heal. Or is it collecting more people who are getting in it for social justice reasons?
I think that's a good question. And that's not something that I necessarily have the answer to. Finding accurate information as to whether or not these different approaches are actually helping people is very difficult, because there's not a whole lot of accounting that happens to show that a certain therapist or style, like that, there's not a lot of tracking as to the clients that people see, unless that is something that the clinician has specifically set up and is working on. There are a few programs that I'm aware of, like Scott Miller's work on super therapists, where there was tracking that was happening of a group of therapists, and there was a subgroup of that had results that were far and away better than everybody else. But typically there's not the same kind of outcome tracking happening in the field for most people. That's something that I personally think should be changed in some way. Certainly, there's some people that would not want to have their time in therapy to be tracked and followed and that sort of thing, and you'd want to account for that. But to have more information about what's actually happening and what's helping would help the entire field. But I think that more to your point, that's it's a really great question as to how much this is actually bringing people down, because you can see in like our outside of environment that we are becoming more fractured, and that there is a huge loss of trust in all of our institutions. And there's no way that this cannot be playing a part in that. It's just a matter of how do we, find metrics to gauge how much of a part that is.
Well, so if it's accreditation, we know that it is in mental health. We know that it's in medical schools. We know that it's in schools of education.
Mm-hmm.
That's a large part of society that is being taught social justice ideology as this new way that people are forced to think. And what happens if you don't agree? You have a story.
Yeah, well, yeah, when I didn't agree, I was initially I was called out. And I guess to get into the details of my story, I found out fairly early on, I guess, that I was not quite fitting in. I didn't really have I had some prior experience with this ideology back in a Unitarian church that I had been a part of, um, from about 2010 to about 2015. But I didn't recognize that that's what it was exactly. That, it seemed like that there was a division there. And I thought that that was localized to that group. Didn't really have any idea that this was a part of a larger philosophical problem that was happening elsewhere. So I went in, and we were told to expect this to be a brave space, and where we would be, we would have our ideas challenged, and we should be prepared for that. And of course, I'm thinking it's like, this sounds great. Yes, let's go in, because that is to debate over ideas and thoughts. That's something that I really otherwise would enjoy. But what I found out through the course of the first 8 weeks or so is that it wasn't really about debate. It was about accepting their one way as the right way. And my first interaction with that was very early on. They brought up the idea of how you can respond when a client is pushing your buttons. And I mentioned the Buddhist practice of the central practice of the non-self, where you just don't think about yourself at all. You reduce your focus on your feelings, and you look at the other person through the lens of loving kindness, and just try and focus on what their needs are and what's coming from them. And I was told almost immediately after that practice might be invalidating to other identities by the professor, and that I should think about that. Maybe that's not a good way to think. And to me, that just was kind of like, that's just crazy. Maybe I assumed that maybe I hadn't explained it very well. I know that can be a little esoteric, and I wasn't, I typically don't talk about those things, so I assumed that I must not have done a good job. And later on, within the next 48 hours, another teacher who hadn't even been there approached me about that, and said that that practice was problematic, and would make people of other identities feel badly. And I'm just like, that made no sense at all to me. And then I was talking to a third professor, and they said, that would have been fine a few years ago, but that's not okay anymore. And I just, I didn't know what to do with that. That just made no sense at all to me.
So when did
And
things start to change? Do you know anything about before you got into school? How quickly did things change to it's not okay to remove yourself from the conversation and to focus on the other person, which seems like what you should be doing in therapy?
I know. Well, I think the one professor who spoke on that a little bit seemed to feel like it was a change that was coming from the students, and that the students in the past would have been more forgiving of little mistakes, but now they're not forgiving anymore. I think that particular professor was underestimating what the trainings were actually doing in the other direction, because I could look at the historical record and see how this was brought in decades prior. But I think there was some finger pointing going on there, that part of it was a result of the pandemic, because I was going in at the end of 2022, which was just after a lot of the things were lifted, and right when the vaccine had come out, and so people were coming and being out a little bit more, regardless of that whole mess, and who knows exactly what happened there. But I think there was a lot of finger pointing happening there. But the way that I see it is that this idea goes back to the 1980s, and what we're seeing now is the fruit that is bearing after several decades of working it into the curriculum and into the therapy and in other areas across the country, because it's not localized to just counseling. it is part of the other psychological fields, but as you pointed out, it is also part of education. So, and a thing to keep in mind is that these training programs also train school counselors who then bring it into the K through 12 schools. So you have it seeping into the culture from multiple sources. And now we're just reaching a point where this has been going on for 30 years or more in some cases. And we're seeing the fruits of that.
I was watching you and a group of other people with FAIR speak a couple of months ago. And one of the things that I heard that was just like, holy cow, this is horrible, was that they were being taught. I don't know if this phrase sounds familiar to you, but it is okay or all right or good to not tolerate the intolerant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that actually taught? Or is it more of is it an idea that's taught, or is the actual phrase taught? Because I'm seeing it a lot with teachers. I'm
Mm-hmm.
seeing it with the more progressive teachers saying, like just out and out saying, I don't only serve Christian cisgender kids. And you're like, nobody's asking you to focus on a child's religion. We're asking you to not teach them to hate other people. That's what we're asking
Mm-hmm.
for. And when people say, oh, well, if you don't bring all of this gender ideology into the classroom, you are hating. No, you've weaponized the term of what is hatred now. You are weak and kind of shallow if you think that me saying, hey, my third grader needs to read good books and be able to do math. That's all my third grader needs to do. And in terms of being kind, you know what? Let's not hit. Maybe let's not give the stinky face to other kids. And other than
Yeah.
that, like, let them be children. That should not be a controversial idea, but it
I
is.
I agree. I think with I think one of the things that has changed over the last several decades that has helped bring this in, particularly through K through 12 schools, is a lot of the aggressive anti-bullying measures. Now, as challenging as bullying can be for some students, and it's funny, this morning I was just going through that global book that the APA has put out about their plan, to spread their psychology globally, but it linked to one of the larger plans as to address bullying. And this one has been implemented, across several different countries in a lot of K through 12 schools. And the way that it works is that the faculty goes through training and they create a group that focuses on bullying issues, and they bring in members of the community. There's training. They have like a big list of bullying rules that they put out, and then they have a big date and they plan, this is our starting date. And after that point, then all of the faculty members are supposed to be focusing on what kids are doing, and if they see bullying, to stop it. And if they see anything that's like that, then they bring both kids in, and they have, what
Restorative
gets
justice.
yes. And what gets
Mhm.
me about this is that there is so much. If you think about it from the perspective of a child, that's just oppressive adult involvement in their problems. How is a kid supposed to figure out how to deal with people's different personalities if at the first sign of there being a problem between two kids, an adult steps in and separates them and sends them to social emotional learning? And we're having these conversations here about, you got to look out for somebody else's feelings. It puts kids in a straitjacket and does not even give them the opportunity to try and fail. They are immediately segmented, and like the whole setup of the school becomes focused around trying to change this basically normal kid behavior. Can it spiral out and cause lots of problems? Sure. But basically, this is normal kid behavior. And how we figure out our boundaries is by, being mean to each other as kids, and having our friends march off and say, I'm not your friend anymore. And then it's like, oh man, maybe I should apologize. It's those interactions that taught us how to manage each other. And what you're seeing today in a lot of the college age kids is that's what they've been through. So they are reaching adulthood without the tools, without even the awareness that their own behavior can be bullying. When if they have an interaction with someone else that they find problematic, rather than having a conversation with that person, they will go and talk to their boss, or bring in
Their
a third
trusted
party,
adults. Yes.
right, to solve that problem. And that's what we're seeing.
Right. Yeah, the work it out is so important, because there are many kids who will fight with each other and then end up the best of friends. So that
Mhm.
I've had that happen. I mean, that's a thing that happens when they are given the time and space to actually grow and mature. So, and sometimes it is as quick as like a couple of hours, and sometimes it takes a couple of years, but people begin to have a respect, or even like actually, you know what? I really like that thing about the person, as opposed to, oh, you get to automatically hate them because they're a bad person. Oh, and by the way, they're a bad person just because they won't use your pronoun. That's enough to
Mhm.
make them a bad, unacceptable person who should be pushed out. Doesn't matter that they believe that it harms you, because giving into a mental health crisis, some kids are like, I'm not going to do that. And some kids, especially these little tiny kids who don't even know what truth is yet, I think it's extremely abusive. One of the words I wanted to ask you about, because we see it all the time, SEL teaches kids to be resilient. But what you're talking about from the college kids that you were with, I don't see resilience there. I see extremely fragile people. What is the mental health, uh, I guess, definition of resilience today?
That's a great question. I think that you would get some very different answers depending on who you talk to. You know, I would say that being resilient is to be able to, take in the negative experiences that you go through, as everyone is going to go through, because that is part of life, and to be able to rebound from those and to come back and to engage in society in a positive way, and to continue to pursue your goals regardless of what it is that has you know been has harmed you, or held you back, or you know caused you to get deflected from that for a short amount of time. um I it trying to think about how that would be characterized by my old professors. I don't even know what they would say. I'm as far as I can tell, that is not something that's really being built into the system anymore. Maybe in that context, resilience would be, well, are you able to go talk to an authority and have them to, put that other person who hurt you down? Maybe that's what they
Soviet.
would think of as resilient.
It's extremely Soviet. What I see is, you will take whatever punishment, you will take whatever crushes you, and be able to handle it and say thank you very much.
Hmm.
That's what I see as resilient today. Or you will become more compliant. That's what it means to be resilient today, because you are not supposed to even engage with people who have different viewpoints than you. So I don't understand how you can be resilient if you can't listen and hear people who might say things that you're like, oh, that makes me feel gross, and come away stronger for it, going, oh, well, thank you. I now have your opinion. I understand it. I don't agree any more than I did. In fact, I agree less. But I don't, you know, I don't know. To me, I can have pity for people that are adopting ideas that I find kind of crazy. Thank you, Rose. Rose just said excellent conversation. um, so I want to dig into the worst of what happened to you. And the reason that I want to do that is because so many people, I've been trying to say, you know what, really, really question putting your kids in counseling. We fast tracked, we passed a bill in the last, I think 2 sessions ago, where we're going to have mobile mental health. So we're fast, right? So we are fast tracking counselors to help our kids. But remember that word help, because oftentimes it's not. I don't know if you saw any of my posts on this, but we recently in a public library at the middle school level, there are books called Gave the Prey Away. And so that's centering around a certain group, but it's not even pretending that it's not dismissing and literally trying to eradicate something else. So I feel like that is a lot of kind of what goes on, that one idea, one view, one worldview, and let me be clear about this, the Judeo-Christian worldview, or the worldview that we can be sovereign as people, as a country, whatever, that worldview is being pushed out. And your children, and you know, I've got a son who will be a senior this year, the are being force fed a new worldview with a very much comply and you're kind, don't comply and you're disposable kind of attitude.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened to you?
Well, from that, I guess the inciting incident there with the Buddhism and that sort of thing, over the course of the next several weeks, I slowly started to figure out that it was not okay to say certain things. And there were some other incidents that happened that I didn't realize, I should have responded in one way. And I went, was authentic to what I actually felt like. For example, one of the things that came up following that was in my skills class, we were asked what our nightmare client would be. And to a person, all of the other people said that their nightmare client would be a racist white man. And I was one of the last ones to respond. And I said, it's like a psychopath and a narcissist, those would be my nightmares. And the professor kind of chided me about that, saying, why would you worry about a psychopath? All they want is love. And I'm just like, that just sounds really crazy to me. And I think by not parroting back what everybody else said, I had identified myself as a problem. Obviously, I wasn't trying to do that, but that is what had happened. And I, that I was feeling tension from the other students and from the professors at that point. And so I reached out to that particular professor who had, up until that point, had seemed fairly understanding and had a reasonable rapport, and said, hey, can we talk about that, because you seem to kind of dismissive of my opinion, and like that, I didn't seem like typical of you. And so I went in and talked to them, and through the course of that conversation, I said, hey, I've had some experiences with people that make me think that these people can be, very challenging, to say the least, and, scary in certain contexts. And, he tried to redirect the conversation around to maybe that I was feeling like I was being humbled to be back in school. And I left it feeling like that, well, that, that's really kind of strange. That's not really exactly how I was feeling. And it just, there was a disconnect there which if you're in a program and you're learning to be a therapist, and you're talking to a professor who is supposed to be teaching you the skills to be a therapist, and you've had a personal conversation with them and there's a disconnect there, that's a problem. But the whatever he took from that conversation, I later found out that he had written down that I had said that I had a problem with men. That's how he interpreted that. And I gotta say, okay, so like if that was true, if I had a problem with men, I must have like some giant balls to go in and have a private conversation with my male professor to tell him that I have a problem with men. I mean, like, either I don't have a problem with men, or man, I don't know. That just doesn't make sense.
What doesn't make
But
sense is that most social justice warriors tend to have a problem with men. It's
right,
constantly the patriarchy. What I
right.
heard, because he said he went back to school, I heard
Mhm.
ageism. That's what I heard.
Yeah,
Like he sounds like he had a problem. But the
yeah.
whole problem with men, it's like, isn't that their whole thing? We hate the patriarchy. Daddy give me, daddy buy me. We hate that patriarchy. Like, okay.
Oh, I know. I know. Well, so things from there, kind of very rapidly went downhill. I got pulled into my advisor's office, and I was told that my professors, they do these periodic evaluations throughout the semester and throughout where all of the professors will get together and basically talk about how each student is doing. And because I have read the accreditation standard, I know what they're discussing. Is part of the accreditation standard is they evaluate you on what they call your professional dispositions. And those include your commitments, your values, your beliefs, and your behaviors. Now, you know, if you're dealing with mental health and you have a student that, is trying to sleep with all of their professors, obviously that behavior is a problem. But, call me an American, but I don't think that there is any any situation where they should be talking about your values and your beliefs. I think that that's unconstitutional in a state university, especially if you're getting state funding. And that is how they are cycling out people who do not adopt these values and beliefs. And you can see it in their program handbooks, where it says that they evaluate based on, how well you're taking in these, are you self-aware? Are you committed? These different values that they list, and they
Mm,
call self-awareness is, do you know that you're white if you're white? And these
right.
sorts of things. So
And it
after
would be more
after
than that. It would be, do you know that you're an oppressor? Correct.
correct, yes,
So
yes, and
it's yeah.
yes, and when you hang in the program long enough, that eventually comes up more directly. Um, but after that meeting, obviously I am panicked because, I'm back in school because I've gotten divorced and I need to get back in the workforce as quickly as I can. I've been a stay-at-home parent for 2 decades. Am I feeling insecure about getting back into the workforce? Of course I am. So, I've been identified as having a problem. I was told that my thinking was too concrete, and that someone had said that I was transphobic, which I don't even know where that came from. I've marched in the local pride parade. This was a few years prior. Went to a Unitarian church that was very loud and
Open.
proud about welcoming gay marriage and all of that. It's like, do whatever you want. Just like, can we all get along, and that sort of thing. Um, had been more of my tack at that point. So, I didn't even know exactly how do I fix, what does it mean to be too concrete in my thinking? And like, how am I supposed to fix that? How am I supposed to prove that even, or how am I supposed to prove that I'm not transphobic? There's no way out there. If you have gotten those labels, there's no way that you can unget those labels. I go from that almost directly to a small group where I was then confronted by the small group, uh, and called out about some of these same things. And that was a disaster. And following that, I reached a point where I realized that part of the program is that they have what they call support plans, where if a student is having problems, it's supposed to be supportive to help you make it through. That was one of the things that I thought was reassuring when I was getting in. It's like, if you start to have problems, we'll support you so that you make it all the way through the program. Well, I recognized after that meeting with my advisor, where it was brought up that I might need a support plan, I might be forcefully applied a support plan, that I'm either going to get one, against my will, or I can, reach out and just, accept it early, and thereby show that I am, taking control or of my own behavior in the situation. And at the time, I still was under the belief that there might actually be some support to it. But what those meetings turned out to be is regular struggle sessions that I went through, where I was told that, I should change my values. I was, told how I had done terrible things in my small groups. I was told that I had been insensitive to my group leader by mentioning that I had gone to school in Greensboro, and I had gone by the Woolworth in Greensboro before it closed, the one where they had the sit-ins at the beginning. That somehow, I still don't understand exactly how it was insensitive for me to mention that, except for that, I guess because I'm white, I shouldn't even talk about that. I guess if you're a white person in these circumstances, and you're in a place where there was an emotionally charged event that happened, 50 years prior, you shouldn't talk about that. I guess that's the ultimate takeaway there. But I joke about it now because it makes it a little bit more manageable, but it was a horrible, horrible experience. And I ended up leaving most of these meetings and having to go just cry in my car, so that I could just get through the day and finish, and then go home and do my assignments. I didn't really have the bandwidth even to think about how I could get myself out of this situation. There's so much work that you have to do in terms of reading and writing the papers and that sort of thing. Looking into legal options, recognizing, has this gone so far that this is, what do I need to do? I just, I didn't really have a whole lot of support. It was just me and my kids. And so I managed to make it to the end of the semester, and I got great grades. I got 3 A's and a B plus. And I think I would have gotten an A in that class if I had had a different professor. That was the one that particularly had an issue with me. But I was brought in 5 days before Christmas, and, then told that, we're going to hold you back, and it's going to take at least a minimum of another year for you to finish, despite the fact that I have all the good grades. They said, we don't think that you're ready to go forward, because I wasn't adopting their values, which means it would have been another year's worth of tuition. What the heck? And another year out of the workforce. And at that point, I had already started to debate whether or not it made sense to stay in this program, because there was obviously fundamentally something really, really wrong. Um, and so I, when they said that I could, stay in, but it's going to take another year, I made the decision, no, I'm not going to stay in. And I left, and I almost immediately filed a complaint with the Office of, I think at the time they were calling it Equity and Inclusion. It didn't, unsurprisingly, it didn't go anywhere.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
I wrote multiple emails to the dean and to the chancellor. They didn't respond. I reached out to local lawyers. I reached out to different networks, and I wasn't able to connect with legal support that could help me before the window closed. If the window has closed, to, like, initially all I wanted was my tuition back so I could,
Right.
you know, get back and try and do something else. And in part of the whole process of trying to just recover from that and understand what was going on, I started to research the field, because my emotional processing immediately after coming out from that, I spent several weeks where I just kind of sat in a chair, and I had one of those little sand things where you flip it over and like the sand goes down, and I just kind of, I looked at it for hours, just flipping it over and over again. And I started to write some little fairy tales, because I like to write fairy tales that help me kind of process. And after I wrote a few of them, I started to realize, like, why am I trying to rewrite Animal Farm? And that was when I really, the light bulbs really started to go off, and I'm like, yeah, this is not okay. And I started to research into the field, and like, how did this program at this state school,
And
flagship
the
of
state that you're in, is it this,
Tennessee?
you're in a
Yeah,
red state,
yeah. It was at the
supposedly.
university. Yeah, it was at the University of Tennessee. In Knoxville here, the flagship program. How did this get to be this way? And that's when I really started to dig in to the history. And when I started to turn up that, there was this initiative to use the therapy room to impress multiculturalism on clients and on students. And I just kept digging, and I kept turning up more and more abuses of power. That's an abuse of power right there, to use the therapy room to force an ideology on people. And it's also an abuse for the college to force that onto the trainees. That's not okay.
So
And
I I need to jump in at this point
okay.
because the things that you're describing in our schools, we have mental health programs, including mental health clubs, where peers diagnose each other, where peers are helping each other. It's all through SEL. So we
Mhm.
have social and emotional learning, and they're choosing kids who are ideal to mentor other kids. I cannot help but listen to what you're saying. And I saw this. I didn't even know what I was seeing when my son was in 5th grade. They read the same book. I can't remember what it was called, but the same book that introduced gender ideology to them in 5th grade. And the second time they decided to read the book, my son was just like, I don't want to know about these relationships. And the kids in his classroom, it was the gifted class, turned to him and said, well, that's not being very kind. So he became, from being this outgoing kid to being very much reserved, um, because he was told he wasn't kind, because as a 5th grade boy, he didn't want to hear about anybody's relationships, straight, gay, anything. And this book was introducing trans. genderism to the kids. But if you couldn't handle it, and I've had another woman, a friend of mine, who after a teacher training pulled into my house, sat in her car and cried. And then she said, I just don't know what to do. I've never been racist in my life. They're telling me I'm racist, Carrie. And I was just like, this isn't your burden. This is their crazy that you're being forced to take on you. And the fact that it is all the way across the board. I've had nurses call me and say these things. I've had counselors call me and say, I wouldn't recommend. We're both, or I'm friends with Leslie Elliott. And she's just like, I would not recommend people go to counseling today, but yet we're throwing them into our schools. And if you can't handle it as a grown woman, and I wouldn't be able to either. Let me just, I would just stand up, tell them what I think, show them some delicate little fingers and walk myself out the door. But the fact that they basically robbed you of a year of tuition, and they bullied you. School is not supposed to be about being bullied. So just because I do like to keep these about an hour, I want to talk to you again, though. I want to continue on if you're open to it. But I do want to keep this at about an hour. And if there's anything that you want to say to wrap this one up, and then I'd like to bring you back on and to really go through what you found eventually.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, I guess to wrap this up, I would say that this is, while this obviously was a problem for me, what I would like people to think about is how this, if this is how they're training counselors, how is this going to show up in psychotherapy and in all of the different points of contact that psychology has? Because it's not just limited to, being in the therapy office. These professions are, and they're actively trying to influence policy, building our schools, trying to solve these systemic problems without, there's no training there. There's no training that tells you how to run a better government, or how to restructure a school system to make it more kind. You don't learn that sort of stuff, but they are being emboldened and empowered to go and make noise and be angry for change. We're here for change. We don't know what we want, but we're here for something different. And people should be very suspicious of that. And I agree 100% with Leslie. I'd be very cautious if I had to interact with these professions right now. Are there places to go that are safe if you really need it? Yes, there are. I've written about it on my Substack, and you can find them. What I personally think will be helpful is for a new profession to start that is grounded in an ethics that puts the client first. And I would love to see that. And I'm hopeful that there will be some other clinicians that will come together around that idea and make a real alternative for people, because, there's untreated mental illness that's happening right now. And then there are people who are being harmed through this therapy that are going to need help getting rewired and back onto a more reasonable path. And I guess if I have one last closing thought, it would be that we need to think more carefully about what it is that we are incentivizing and encouraging in our schools. And I'm thinking right now about anti-bullying initiatives. As much as we want to make our lives easy and to have comfort, that might not necessarily get us the results that we really want or we really need. And I think that has, some of those changes have been a big factor in to putting us where we are right now.
Yeah. Yep. I just I think that what we have to do right now is realize that everything we're being told is, or not everything, but the majority of what we're being told is how you would destroy a country. And so we need to do the opposite in as many ways as possible. So when they say, "Oh, family is the biggest burden on the biggest burden on a mother and father is having children," no, bring your children in, focus on them. Oh, kids are stressed out when they have to do too much reading, they have to do too much academic. No, give them the books and like really like go down. I handed my son Yeonmi Park's book, um her second one. We just got it this weekend, and so I handed that to him. And then I've also said, before you go back to school, which is like the 17th of August, before you go back to school, you have to read Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, um because I want you to have this grounding when you go into this place that I honestly think is the lion's den. But I also know there's some good people in there, and I also think it's good for him to be able to hear different points of view. I think that that is vital. um but if it turns into your kind of struggle session, that door is open. Like, just
Mm-hmm.
come right back home, buddy. You don't need this in your life. So um because I do think that it's going to lead, quite frankly, a lot of people into very, very dark places. I think
Mm-hmm.
that if we don't stop this, we will repeat history. And we have to. We just have to. And the fact is that we can be honest. We can say that's a bunch of garbage. We're not doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And the more and more we have these kind of conversations, the more that gets out there and people go, "Oh, that's what they're doing? No, thank you." If we leave them without clients, things will be forced to change. So, Susanna, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. And I am going to just, as soon as we get off, we can schedule the next one, because I do want to continue to dig into this thing that is so huge. Mental
Alrighty.
health is a huge focus. So I really appreciate you being on. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you again for having me. It's a pleasure.
You too. All right, let me end this for everybody. Thanks everybody for staying on. And next time, please do feel free to write more in the comments. My friend Rose has said many, many complimentary things about you, and she's also from Tennessee.
Ah.
So let me just hit